The town of Gallows Mercy sat in the Texas Panhandle like a wound that had scabbed over wrong, healed crooked, and never stopped reminding the body it belonged to that something underneath was still broken. It earned its name from the original settlers, a mixed group of cattlemen and deserters and people running from worse places who had built it in 1861 with the specific, bitter humor of people who understood exactly what kind of place they were building. The main street ran east to west along a dry wash, lined with timber buildings gone silver gray from decades of relentless panhandle sun and wind, and at the center of town stood the one structure that had been maintained with any real care. The Cattleman's Bank, brick and proper, looking like something transplanted from a city that had no business existing out here. It was into this town, on a blistering July afternoon in 1885, that Wade Garrity rode. He came from the south, out of the brush country, on a buckskin mare that had carried him 11 hard days without complaint. Wade was 38, built solid through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent 15 years working cattle before circumstances turned him toward other work, and his face carried the specific weathering of someone who had spent most of his adult life outdoors and very little of it at peace. His left hand was missing 2 fingers, lost 3 years ago in a dispute that had started over a stolen herd and ended with considerably more loss than fingers, and he had adapted his draw and his rope work around the absence with the stubborn practicality of a man who refused to let an injury define his usefulness. He carried a single Colt, worn cross draw on his right hip, and a coiled lariat that marked him as a working cattleman as much as the gun marked him as something else. His eyes were brown and steady and carried the particular fatigue of a man who has been riding toward something difficult for a long time and is now close enough to feel the weight of a rival pressing against him. He had come to Gallows Mercy because of his sister. Hannah Garrity had married into the Calloway family 6 years ago, good ranching people, established, respected throughout the eastern panhandle. Hannah's husband Reese Calloway had inherited 40,000 acres of grazing land along the Canadian River, prime cattle country, and had built it into one of the most productive operations in the territory. Wade had visited twice in those 6 years, brief stays between cattle drives, and had watched his sister build a life that seemed, from the outside, to be everything a hard childhood in Comanche country had denied them both. 3 months ago, Reese Calloway had been found dead in the Canadian River, drowned according to the official finding, though Reese had been raised on that river and swam it as easily as he walked solid ground. 2 weeks after the funeral, a man named Silas Vane Whitlock had arrived in Gallows Mercy with papers claiming the Calloway Ranch's water rights and grazing leases had been improperly filed for a decade, and that the Territorial Land Office was reclaiming the holdings pending a new lease auction, an auction Whitlock's own company, the Llano Estacado Cattle and Land Company, was positioned to win. Hannah's letter, 3 weeks old and water-stained from the journey, had reached Wade in Fort Worth with 4 words underlined twice: "They killed him, Wade." He rode into Gallows Mercy with that letter folded in his breast pocket and stopped his mare in front of the bank, looking at the building's clean brick face against the weathered town around it, and understood immediately that whatever was happening here had money behind it, real money, organized money, the kind that didn't announce itself through violence first but through paperwork, and saved the violence for when paperwork wasn't sufficient. He dismounted and tied off and stood for a moment scanning the street the way 15 years of careful living had trained him to. A dog watched him from beneath a porch. 2 men on the boardwalk outside the saloon stopped talking when he passed, which told him his arrival had been noted before he'd said a word to anyone. He walked toward the edge of town, toward the Calloway Ranch Road, and felt the specific, familiar tightening in his chest that came before difficult things, not fear exactly, but its disciplined cousin, the readiness that fear becomes when a man has decided what he's willing to do about it. The Calloway Ranch house sat 2 miles outside Gallows Mercy, a sprawling timber structure that Reese had built with his own hands over the first 3 years of his marriage, and Wade rode up the long approach road as the afternoon light went golden heavy across the grassland. Cattle moved in the distance, fewer than he remembered from his last visit, and the fence lines along the road showed the specific neglect of a property whose owner no longer had the resources or confidence to maintain them properly. Hannah came out onto the porch before he'd fully dismounted, and the sight of her stopped him for a moment. She was 34, 2 years younger than him, and she had always carried herself with their mother's particular straight-back dignity, but the woman on the porch had lost weight she couldn't spare and carried dark circles under eyes that had clearly not slept well in months. She came down the steps and into his arms without speaking, and he held his sister and felt her shaking slightly, controlled but present, the specific tremor of someone who has been holding herself together through sheer will for longer than will alone should have to manage. "I didn't think you'd come," she said finally, stepping back. "I sent that letter not knowing if it would even reach you." "You should have known better," Wade said. Inside, over coffee that Hannah's hands shook slightly pouring, she told him everything. Reese had been increasingly worried in his final months, not about the ranch's productivity, which remained strong, but about a series of visits from Territorial Land Office representatives who had begun questioning the original filing documents for the water rights along their stretch of the Canadian River. Reese had filed those rights himself, 11 years ago, properly and legally, and had the original receipts and survey documents to prove it. But the representatives kept returning, kept finding new technical questions, kept suggesting that perhaps a voluntary lease arrangement with a company called Llano Estacado would resolve the uncertainty more efficiently than continued legal dispute. Reese had refused, repeatedly, and had begun making trips to Amarillo to consult with a lawyer about challenging what he'd come to believe was a coordinated effort to seize the property through manufactured legal confusion. He had been planning one more trip to Amarillo, to file a formal protest with documentation he'd spent weeks assembling, when he'd been found dead in the river 3 days before he was scheduled to leave. The sheriff said he must have gone swimming and hit his head on a rock, Hannah said, her voice flat with the specific exhaustion of repeating something she didn't believe for the 100th time. Reese grew up on that river, Wade. He knew every rock in it. He wouldn't have hit his head on something he'd been swimming around since he was 6 years old. Wade set down his coffee cup. Where's the documentation he was assembling? The protest filing. Hannah's jaw tightened. Gone. I looked everywhere after the funeral. His office, the house, the bank lockbox. Everything related to the land office dispute is gone, Wade. Like it never existed. But you remember what was in it. Some of it. Not all the specifics. Reese kept the details mostly in his head and in notes he didn't always show me. But I remember the broad strokes. He'd found something about the land office representatives. Something about who they actually worked for beneath the official title. She looked at her brother with eyes that held both grief and the particular sharpness of someone whose grief had crystallized into purpose. He said the name Whitlock wasn't the real problem. He said Whitlock was just the face they put forward. There was someone else behind it. Someone with enough reach to manipulate territorial land filings across multiple counties. Wade looked at his sister for a long moment. You're going to tell me you have an idea who that is, he said. Hannah reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded paper, worn soft from handling. 2 days before he died, she said, Reese mentioned a name to me. Just once, almost in passing, like he wasn't sure he should say it out loud yet. Augustus Pemberton. She unfolded the paper, which Wade saw was a newspaper clipping, badly creased. Territorial Land Commissioner. Based out of Austin. His name is on half the legitimate filings in this part of the state. She looked at Wade. Reese said something was wrong with how often Pemberton's office processed disputes in favor of companies that turned out to be connected to each other through ownership structures Reese couldn't fully untangle but had started to map. Wade took the clipping and studied it, an unremarkable photograph of an unremarkable-looking official at some territorial function, the kind of bureaucratic notice that meant nothing to most readers and apparently everything to a dead man who had started asking the wrong questions. Then that's where we start, he said. Not with Whitlock, with whoever Whitlock answers to. The next morning, Wade rode into Gallows Mercy alone, leaving Hannah at the ranch with instructions to stay close to the house and to keep the rifle loaded that he'd checked over the previous evening. He went directly to the Cattleman's Bank, the only building in town that suggested anyone here handled serious money, and asked to speak with whoever managed accounts related to land transactions. The bank manager, a nervous, precise man named Elmer Castellan, agreed to see him after Wade mentioned he was Reese Calloway's brother-in-law, and something flickered across Castellan's face at the name that Wade filed away immediately, not surprise, but the specific discomfort of a man who has information he's not sure he should share. Mr. Calloway's death was a tragedy, Castellan said, settling behind his desk with the careful formality of someone reciting something rehearsed. The whole town felt it. I'm sure they did, Wade said. I'm trying to understand the land dispute he was dealing with before he died. The water rights filing. Castellan's hands moved papers on his desk without purpose, the nervous gesture of someone buying time. That's a territorial land office matter, Mr. Garrity. I wouldn't have direct knowledge of the specifics. But the bank would have records of any transactions related to it, Wade said. Loan applications, lease agreements, anything Llano Estacado might have filed through this institution to finance their bid for the Calloway leases. Castellan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm not in a position to discuss other clients' banking matters. Wade leaned forward slightly. I understand that, Mr. Castellan. I'm not asking you to violate anyone's confidence. I'm asking you, as a man who presumably wants to do right by a community that lost a good rancher under questionable circumstances, whether there's anything you've noticed, anything at all, that struck you as unusual about how the Llano Estacado paperwork moved through this bank. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Wade began to think he'd get nothing. Then Castellan glanced toward his office door, confirmed it was closed, and lowered his voice. There was a loan disbursement, he said carefully, 6 weeks before Mr. Calloway's death. Significant sum, processed through this bank on behalf of Llano Estacado, ostensibly for ranch improvements on land they hadn't yet acquired. He paused. The authorization for that disbursement required Mr. Whitlock's signature and a co-signature from a territorial land office representative confirming the land transfer was already in process. Was it in process? Castellan's eyes met his. Officially, the land transfer wasn't approved until 3 weeks after Mr. Calloway died. The co-signature on that loan document is dated 6 weeks before his death. He swallowed. I noticed the discrepancy when I was reconciling the bank's quarterly records last month. I haven't said anything to anyone because, he stopped. Because you're afraid of what happens to a bank manager who notices things he's not supposed to notice, Wade finished quietly. Castellan didn't answer, which was answer enough. I need to see that document, Wade said. Or a copy of it. I can't simply hand over banking records, Mr. Garrity. I'd lose my position, possibly face legal consequences. Mr. Castellan, Wade said, his voice low and direct, a man is dead. My sister's husband. Murdered, I believe, to clear the way for exactly the kind of fraudulent transaction you just described. I'm not asking you to do something illegal. I'm asking you to help expose something that already is. Castellan sat very still for a long moment, his nervous hands finally going quiet on the desk. Then he stood, walked to a locked cabinet behind his desk, and removed a ledger. I keep my own private notations, he said, not quite meeting Wade's eyes. For my own protection, in case anyone ever questioned my handling of accounts. I have the document numbers, the dates, the names involved. He looked up. If you can get this in front of someone with actual authority, a federal marshal, a judge who isn't compromised, I'll testify to what I've shown you. But not before, not without that protection in place. Wade nodded slowly. That's fair, he said. Give me what you can write down. Names, dates, document numbers. I'll find someone with the authority to act on it. Wade left the bank with 3 pages of Castellan's careful notations folded inside his coat and walked the 2 blocks to the squat timber building that served as the Llano Estacado Cattle and Land Company's local office. He had no clear plan for the visit beyond getting eyes on Silas Whitlock directly, taking the measure of the man whose name sat at the center of whatever had happened to Reese Calloway. Whitlock turned out to be younger than Wade expected, perhaps 40, well-dressed in a manner that suggested money spent deliberately to project respectability, with the smooth, unhurried manner of a man accustomed to being believed. He greeted Wade with professional warmth that didn't extend to his eyes, which performed the same rapid assessment Wade had performed on him. Mr. Garrity, Whitlock said, gesturing to a chair. Word travels fast in a small town. I understand you're Hannah Calloway's brother. I am, Wade said, remaining standing. A terrible loss, her husband's passing. The whole community grieved with her. Whitlock's voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone who had said the same words many times and felt them not at all. I hope she's managing as well as can be expected, given the circumstances. She's managing, Wade said. What I'm trying to understand, Mr. Whitlock, is the timeline on your company's interest in the Calloway grazing leases. I understand the land office only finalized the transfer authorization 3 weeks after Reese died. Something flickered behind Whitlock's eyes, brief, controlled, but present. The Territorial Land Office processes these matters according to its own schedule, Mr. Garrity. I'm not privy to their internal timing. That's interesting, Wade said, because I have documentation suggesting your company secured significant financing 6 weeks before Reese's death, based on a representation that the land transfer was already underway. Whitlock's expression didn't change, but something in the room's temperature seemed to shift. I'd be very careful about the source of whatever documentation you believe you have, Mr. Garrity. Banking records are confidential, and anyone sharing them improperly would face serious legal exposure. I'm not interested in your warnings, Wade said. I'm interested in why a financing document for land your company hadn't legally acquired was co-signed by a Territorial Land Office representative weeks before that land's previous owner died under circumstances the sheriff was remarkably quick to rule accidental. Whitlock stood slowly, the the warmth gone entirely now, replaced by something colder and more calculating. I think this conversation has run its course, Mr. Garrity. I'd suggest you focus your energy on supporting your grieving sister rather than chasing conspiracies that exist only in your imagination. He paused at the door. This territory can be dangerous for men who go looking for trouble that isn't theirs to find. Reese Calloway thought it was his trouble to find, Wade said. Right up until someone made sure he stopped thinking about anything at all. Whitlock's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the same controlled tell Castellan had shown, but harder, more practiced at concealment. Good day, Mr. Garrity, he said, and opened the door, making the conversation's end a physical fact rather than a verbal one. Wade walked out into the harsh afternoon light and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, replaying the exchange. Whitlock hadn't denied the substance of the accusation, he'd deflected, warned, threatened in the careful language of a man who understood exactly how far threats could go before they became actionable evidence themselves. It told Wade two things clearly. Whitlock knew precisely what had happened to Reese, and Whitlock was frightened enough of exposure to abandon his earlier diplomatic pretense within minutes of being pressed. He needed federal authority now, someone outside Pemberton's territorial reach, someone who could move against a land commissioner without first asking that commissioner's permission. He thought of the name Reese had uncovered, Augustus Pemberton, and understood that finding leverage against a man who controlled land filings across multiple counties would require help he didn't currently have. Wade found what he needed 3 days later, in the unlikely form of a dust-covered stranger who rode into Gallows Mercy asking quiet questions of his own. Marshal Curtis Ellery had been investigating territorial land fraud patterns across the Panhandle for 8 months, working from Fort Worth under federal authority that specifically bypassed state and territorial officials suspected of complicity. He found Wade through Castellan, who had quietly mentioned to a trusted contact that someone was asking the right kind of questions about Llano Estacado, and that contact had reached Ellery through channels Wade didn't fully understand but was grateful existed. They met in the back room of Pryor's old saddle shop, now run by Pryor's nephew, a space chosen for its distance from anywhere Whitlock's people might think to watch. Ellery was lean, weathered, with the particular quality of a man who had spent years working cases that powerful people wanted buried, and he listened to Wade's account with the careful attention of someone cross-referencing every detail against information he already possessed. Pemberton, Ellery said when Wade finished, isn't just corrupt. He's the architect. I've traced 11 separate land seizures across 4 counties back to filing irregularities that all root through his office, all benefiting companies with hidden ownership ties to a holding structure based in Austin. He pulled out a worn notebook. Llano Estacado is one arm of it. There are at least 3 others operating under different names in different counties, all feeding the same financial structure. Castellan's documentation, Wade said. The forged co-signature on the loan disbursement. Is that enough? It's a thread, Ellery said. Combined with what I already have, it might be enough to pull the whole operation apart, if we can get it in front of a federal judge before Pemberton's people realize how close we are. He looked at Wade steadily. But we need more. We need direct evidence connecting Pemberton to Calloway's death, not just the land fraud. Otherwise Pemberton answers for paperwork irregularities and someone else takes the fall for murder, if anyone takes the fall at all. Reese was building exactly that evidence before he died, Wade said. Hannah said he'd mapped ownership connections. That documentation disappeared. Ellery's eyes sharpened. Disappeared, or was taken? Taken, Wade said. Someone went through his office and his lockbox within days of his death. Nothing else was disturbed, just the documents related to the dispute. Then someone close to the investigation knew exactly what to look for and where to find it, Ellery said slowly. Which means someone local was working with Pemberton's people. Someone with access to Reese's private spaces. Wade felt something cold settle in his chest. The sheriff, he said. He ruled it an accident in less than a day. Never investigated who might have been with Reese at the river. Sheriff's name, Tobias Crane. Ellery wrote it down. I'll need to look at him carefully. Quietly, he closed his notebook. Here's what I need from you, Garrity. Castellan's documentation, sworn and notarized if he'll do it. Anything else Hannah remembers from Reese's investigation, no matter how small. And patience, this needs to be airtight before we move, or Pemberton's reach pulls everyone involved under before charges ever get filed. Wade approached Sheriff Tobias Crane 2 days later with the specific, careful neutrality of a man who suspected but couldn't yet prove that he was speaking with someone complicit in his brother-in-law's murder. Crane's office sat adjacent to the jail at the western end of Gallows Mercy's main street, and the sheriff himself was a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and the particular stillness of someone carrying a weight he'd rather not examine too closely. "Mr. Garrity," Crane said, not rising from behind his desk. "I figured you'd come around eventually. I'm trying to understand the investigation into Reese Calloway's death," Wade said. "Specifically why there wasn't one." Crane's jaw worked for a moment. The evidence was clear. Drowning, consistent with an accident. "I had no cause to investigate further. He swam that river his whole life," Wade said. "Knew it better than anyone in this county. Accidents happen to people who know things well, Mr. Garrity. That's what makes them accidents." Wade studied him for a long moment, noting the way Crane's eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the street, as though watching for someone he expected might appear. "Who told you to close the case quickly, Sheriff?" Something shifted in Crane's tired face, not surprise, but a kind of resignation, as though he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask the question directly. He was quiet for a long moment. "I have a daughter in Amarillo," he said finally, his voice low. "Medical school. Expensive. Someone made it clear that her continued enrollment depended on my cooperation regarding certain matters in this county." He looked up at Wade with something close to shame. "I didn't kill your brother-in-law, Mr. Garrity, but I didn't look too hard at who did, either. That's its own kind of guilt, and I've been carrying it every day since." "Who approached you?" Crane hesitated, then said, "A man who works for Whitlock. Goes by Dade. He's not local, came in from Austin around the time Llano Estacado set up their office here." He paused. "Dade was seen near the river the morning Reese died. I noted it at the time and then chose not to pursue it." Wade felt the cold certainty settling into place. "Would you testify to that? To Dade's presence, to the pressure you were put under?" Crane looked at his desk for a long moment, then back at Wade. "If it means my daughter loses her place at that school, I'll have to live with that consequence too," he said. "But I'm tired of living with the other one." He straightened slightly. "Yes, I'll testify, if it comes to that. Tell your federal man I'll cooperate." Marshal Ellery's investigation into the man called Dade moved quickly once Crane's information gave it direction. Dade's full name, according to records Ellery pulled from a contact in Austin, was Garland Dade, a man with a history of enforcement work for land development interests across 3 territories, never convicted of anything serious despite a trail of suspicious deaths following his employment patterns with disturbing consistency. "He's careful," Ellery told Wade and Hannah, gathered now in the same back room at Pryor's nephew's saddle shop. "Professional. The kind of man who doesn't leave evidence behind because he's done this enough times to know exactly what evidence looks like." He spread several pages across the table. 3 suspicious deaths in the last 6 years, all connected to land disputes, all ruled accidental by local authorities who later showed signs of sudden financial improvement. Hannah's hands tightened on the table edge. "He killed Reese," she said, not a question. "I believe so," Ellery said. "But believing it and proving it in a way that survives a federal courtroom are different challenges." Crane's testimony about Dade's presence near the river helps, but it's circumstantial without more. Wade leaned forward. "Then we need Dade himself. Get him talking, get him to make a mistake, or get evidence of what he's actually done." "That's dangerous," Ellery said. "A man with his history isn't going to confess over coffee." "I'm not planning coffee," Wade said. That evening, Wade located Dade at the Gallows Mercy Saloon, a lean, watchful man in his 40s with pale eyes and the specific economy of movement that Wade recognized from his own years of dangerous work. Dade sat alone at the bar's end, nursing a whiskey with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that rushing anything dangerous was how careful men became dead men. Wade sat 2 stools down and ordered a whiskey of his own. "Heard you do work for Llano Estacado," he said, not looking directly at Dade. "Heard a lot of things in this town lately," Dade said, his voice flat and unhurried. "Most of it nonsense from a grieving brother-in-law who can't accept an accident for what it was." "You were seen near the river that morning," Wade said. Dade's hand stayed steady around his glass, but something in his pale eyes sharpened. "I walk a lot of mornings, Mr. Garrity. Helps me think." He finally turned to look at Wade directly. "I'd think carefully about what you're suggesting, and who you're suggesting it to. This territory has a way of being unkind to men who ask too many questions about things that don't concern them." "My sister's husband concerns me," Wade said. Dade studied him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his pale eyes. "Your sister's husband drowned," he said slowly. "That's a tragedy. Tragedies don't always have someone to blame, Mr. Garrity. Sometimes the river just takes what it wants. He stood, dropping coins on the bar. I'd let this rest, if I were you. For your sister's sake, if not your own. He walked out into the evening, and Wade watched him go, certain now beyond any reasonable doubt, and equally certain that certainty alone would never be enough to bring federal charges. Ellery's plan, developed over the following week with Wade's reluctant agreement, required using Wade himself as bait, a calculated risk built on the assumption that Dade and Whitlock, having failed to intimidate Wade into silence, would eventually decide that permanent silence was the only remaining option. Ellery positioned 2 additional federal deputies in Gallows Mercy under cover of being cattle buyers, while Hannah was moved to stay with a trusted family friend outside town, beyond any reach Whitlock's people might attempt. Wade made himself visible and predictable for 3 days, visiting the bank, visiting Crane's office, riding the road between town and the Callaway Ranch at consistent times each day, presenting the specific pattern of a man who hadn't learned caution despite clear warnings. He carried his Colt loaded and ready, and he felt the particular tension of a man who has deliberately made himself a target, trusting in preparation and federal backup to manage the risk he'd chosen to accept. The attempt came on the 4th evening, on the ranch road 2 miles outside town, in the deepening dusk that Dade had clearly chosen for the visibility it denied without yet providing full darkness for concealment. Wade heard the rider approaching from behind at a pace too fast for casual travel and was already turning his mare when the first shot cracked across the open grassland, missing him by inches as he threw himself from the saddle into the roadside brush. Dade came on hard, firing again as Wade scrambled for cover, and Wade returned fire from behind a fallen cottonwood, his missing fingers costing him nothing in this moment because his draw had adapted years ago to work without them. The exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds, Dade's horse screaming as a round caught its flank, Dade himself diving clear and rolling into a firing position with the practiced economy of a professional who had survived exactly this kind of exchange before. Then Ellery's deputies arrived from their concealed positions along the road, and Dade, recognizing the geometry of his situation had shifted catastrophically, made the calculation that surrender offered better odds than continued resistance. He dropped his weapon as the deputies closed in, his pale eyes carrying the flat, professional acceptance of a man who understood the game had simply been lost this time, nothing more, nothing personal in the loss itself. "You're going to hang for Reese Callaway," Wade said, walking forward as the deputies secured Dade's wrists. Dade looked at him with something almost like respect. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe Pemberton's lawyers find a way to make this disappear too. You'd be surprised what money can make disappear, Mr. Garrity." But something in his voice lacked full conviction, the specific uncertainty of a man whose previous protections had just been demonstrated to have limits he hadn't fully anticipated. Dade's cooperation came not from conscience but from the same cold calculation that had governed his entire career. Facing a federal murder charge with documented evidence of a botched assassination attempt, he assessed correctly that his only remaining leverage was information, and information required a buyer willing to negotiate. Ellery, working with a federal prosecutor who arrived from Fort Worth within 2 days of the failed ambush, offered Dade a reduced sentence in exchange for complete testimony regarding Pemberton's operation and detailed confession to Reese Callaway's murder. What Dade provided over the following week of structured interviews exceeded even Ellery's expectations. Pemberton's operation extended across 6 counties, not 4, with land seizures totaling over 200,000 acres acquired through a consistent pattern of manufactured filing disputes, intimidation, and when necessary, the kind of permanent resolution Dade specialized in providing. Reese Callaway had been the 4th such resolution in 3 years, and Dade provided specific details, the exact method, the timing, the assistance he'd received from a Llano Estacado employee who had monitored Reese's movements and reported his planned trip to Amarillo, prompting the accelerated timeline for his death. He named Pemberton directly as the operations architect, described meetings in Austin where land seizure targets were selected based on resource value and owner vulnerability, and confirmed that Whitlock served as the field operator for Pemberton's interests in the Panhandle region specifically, managing 3 other shell companies beyond Llano Estacado that operated under different names but identical ownership structures. "Pemberton doesn't think of himself as a criminal," Dade said during one interview, his voice carrying the flat detachment he brought to everything. "He thinks of himself as efficient. Land sitting underutilized by small ranchers, in his view, represents waste. He's simply correcting inefficiency, with whatever tools the correction requires. Including murder," Ellery said. "Including whatever's necessary," Dade said. "He doesn't pull triggers himself. Men like me handle that part. Keeps his hands clean, in his own mind at least." Wade, observing from outside the formal interview room as Ellery had permitted, felt something settle in his chest at finally hearing the full architecture of what had killed his brother-in-law. Not random violence, but calculated, repeated, industrial-scale theft conducted through murder as a routine operational cost. The clarity didn't bring satisfaction. It brought instead a deeper, colder resolve to see the entire structure dismantled, not just Dade's portion of it. With Dade's testimony providing the connective evidence Ellery needed, federal marshals arrested Silas Whitlock at his Llano Estacado office 3 days later, moving quickly before word of Dade's cooperation could reach Austin and trigger whatever evasive measures Pemberton's broader network might employ. Whitlock's arrest produced none of the violent resistance Dade's capture had required. Whitlock was, fundamentally, a paperwork criminal, comfortable directing violence from a distance but possessing no capacity for it himself when confronted directly. He attempted, in his initial questioning, to position himself as merely a businessman who had relied in good faith on land office representations regarding the Callaway property's status, professing complete ignorance of any violence connected to the acquisition. This defense collapsed within hours when Ellery presented him with Castellan's banking documentation showing the pre-dated co-signature, combined with Dade's detailed testimony specifically naming Whitlock as having ordered the acceleration of Reese's death once Reese's Amarillo trip and accompanying documentation became known. Whitlock, recognizing the comprehensive nature of evidence arrayed against him, made his own calculation toward cooperation, providing detailed financial records connecting Llano Estacado's ownership structure directly to a holding company controlled by Pemberton through 3 intermediary layers designed specifically to obscure the connection from casual examination. He also provided correspondence, letters he had foolishly retained despite their incriminating content, in which Pemberton had explicitly directed the Callaway acquisition timeline and authorized whatever measures proved necessary to resolve Reese's resistance. "I never told Dade to kill anyone specifically," Whitlock insisted during his formal statement, the particular self-serving distinction of a man trying to minimize his culpability through technical parsing. "I conveyed Pemberton's instructions regarding necessary measures. What Dade chose to interpret that as his own decision. A decision you never questioned or reported," the federal prosecutor noted, despite a man turning up dead within days of receiving those instructions. Whitlock had no adequate response to this, and his silence in that moment told Wade, observing from the courthouse hallway, everything he needed to know about the man's actual moral position regarding what had happened to Reese Callaway. With Whitlock and Dade both cooperating and the evidentiary chain now connecting directly to Pemberton, Ellery determined that arresting the land commissioner required moving quickly, before Pemberton's extensive political connections in Austin could mount resistance or, worse, allow him to flee beyond practical federal reach. The journey from Gallows Mercy to Austin required 5 days of hard travel, and Ellery requested Wade's continued participation, both for his direct knowledge of the case and for the simple practical value of additional capable protection during what promised to be a dangerous final confrontation. Hannah insisted on accompanying them as well, despite Wade's reservations about the danger involved. "Reese died because of this man," she said, with the particular steel that had carried her through the previous difficult months. "I'm not staying behind while other people finish what he started discovering. I have a right to see this through." They traveled with a contingent of 4 federal marshals, moving along routes Ellery selected specifically to avoid towns where Pemberton's influence might extend, and the 5 days passed with the particular tension of people approaching a confrontation they understood would determine everything that had been built toward across the preceding months. Wade spent the long riding hours reviewing every detail of Castellan's documentation, Crane's testimony, Dade's confession, and Whitlock's correspondence, ensuring he understood the case as thoroughly as Ellery himself, prepared for whatever complications Pemberton's resources might attempt to manufacture upon their arrival. Austin, when they reached it, presented itself as everything Gallows Mercy was not: proper streets, substantial buildings, the particular bustle of a city that considered itself the legitimate center of territorial governance. Pemberton's office occupied an impressive building near the territorial capital, brick and marble suggesting the permanence and authority that his actual conduct had so thoroughly betrayed. Ellery had arranged, through careful coordination with federal judicial authorities who operated outside Pemberton's territorial influence, for a federal judge to issue the arrest warrant in advance, ensuring no opportunity existed for Pemberton's allies to intervene procedurally before the arrest could be executed. They arrived at his office on a Tuesday morning, federal marshals positioned at every exit, and Ellery himself led the small group up the marble stairs toward Pemberton's private chambers. Pemberton received them with the particular composed surprise of a man who had clearly not anticipated this specific confrontation, though something in his eyes suggested he had long understood it might eventually arrive in some form. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, dressed with the deliberate respectability of a man who had spent decades cultivating an image of trustworthy public service while conducting business considerably less trustworthy beneath that careful surface. "Marshall Ellery," he said, rising from behind an impressive desk. "I understand you've been conducting some kind of investigation in the Panhandle region. I trust you'll forgive me if I express some confusion at this unannounced visit." "Augustus Pemberton," Ellery said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud in territorial land filings, and racketeering across multiple counties." He produced the federal warrant. "I'd advise you to cooperate fully. The evidence against you is comprehensive." Something flickered across Pemberton's composed face, not panic, but the rapid calculation of a man assessing exactly how comprehensive that evidence might actually be. "This is clearly some misunderstanding," he said, his voice maintaining its careful modulation despite whatever calculation was occurring behind it. "I'm a territorial official who processes land filings according to established legal procedures. Whatever disputes may have arisen regarding specific properties are matters for civil resolution, not criminal." "Silas Whitlock has provided detailed testimony," Ellery interrupted, "along with correspondence in your own handwriting directing the acquisition of the Callaway property and authorizing necessary measures regarding Reese Callaway's resistance. Garland Dade has confessed to Callaway's murder and identified Whitlock as having communicated your specific instructions." He paused. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Mr. Pemberton. This is the end of an operation that's killed at least 4 people across 3 years, and you're going to answer for every one of them." Pemberton's composed mask finally cracked, something cold and calculating emerging beneath it that Wade recognized as the man's true character finally surfacing now that pretense had become useless. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Pemberton said, his voice low and hard. "This territory's development requires consolidation of inefficient small holdings into productive operations capable of actual economic contribution. I've simply been facilitating progress that small-minded ranchers were too short-sighted to embrace voluntarily." "You murdered my husband," Hannah said, stepping forward, her voice carrying a controlled fury that filled the room. "Because he refused to let you steal land he built with his own hands." Pemberton looked at her with something close to genuine puzzlement, as though her grief represented an inconvenience he found difficult to fully comprehend. "Mrs. Callaway, I understand your loss feels personal. But progress has always required certain sacrifices. Your husband simply happened to be positioned poorly relative to necessary territorial development." "Cuff him," Ellery said to the deputies, his voice carrying clear disgust at Pemberton's casual dismissal of murder as mere development friction. The federal trial of Augustus Pemberton, conducted in Austin before a judge specifically selected for independence from territorial political influence, ran for 3 weeks and produced the kind of comprehensive public accounting that Wade had hoped for since first reading Hannah's water-stained letter in Fort Worth. The prosecution presented Castellan's documentation, Crane's testimony regarding the pressure applied to close the investigation. Prematurely, Dade's detailed confession to Reese's murder and 3 additional killings connected to other land seizures, and Whitlock's correspondence directly implicating Pemberton in authorizing violence. Pemberton's defense attempted to characterize the entire prosecution as a misunderstanding of legitimate territorial development practices, arguing that any violence had been the independent action of subordinates acting beyond his explicit authorization. This defense collapsed decisively when the prosecution introduced additional correspondence, uncovered during the investigation of Pemberton's Austin office, explicitly detailing his personal selection of seizure targets based on resource value assessments and his direct authorization of permanent resolution for owners who proved resistant to voluntary acquisition. Hannah testified about Reese's character, about his lifetime familiarity with the Canadian River that made accidental drowning implausible, about his final months of growing concern regarding the land office's irregular conduct. Her testimony, delivered with controlled but evident grief, provided the human dimension that complemented the prosecution's technical, financial and legal evidence, ensuring the jury understood Pemberton's crimes not merely as abstract fraud but as the direct cause of a specific man's violent death and a family's devastating loss. Wade testified regarding his investigation, his confrontations with Whitlock and Dade, and the ambush attempt that had nearly cost him his own life. His testimony, delivered with the same steady directness that had characterized his 15 years of cattle work, carried particular weight given his evident lack of dramatic embellishment, presenting facts plainly and allowing their inherent severity to speak without need for rhetorical emphasis. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning convictions on all charges: conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy against territorial land filing integrity across multiple counties. The judge sentenced Pemberton to life imprisonment, with the specific judicial commentary that the scale and calculated nature of his crimes, conducted under color of legitimate authority, represented a particularly egregious betrayal of public trust deserving the maximum available consequence. In the months following Pemberton's conviction, the federal investigation expanded considerably beyond its original scope, ultimately identifying and prosecuting 11 additional individuals connected to the broader land seizure operation across the 6 affected counties. The Callaway Ranch's water rights and grazing leases were formally confirmed under Hannah's ownership through federal court order, along with similar restitution proceedings for 3 other families whose land had been seized through the same fraudulent mechanisms Pemberton had orchestrated. Sheriff Tobias Crane resigned his position following his testimony, accepting whatever professional consequences resulted from his earlier complicity while expressing public regret for his failure to properly investigate Reese's death. His daughter's medical education, ironically, proceeded uninterrupted. The threat that had originally compromised his cooperation revealed as exactly the kind of empty leverage that Pemberton's organization had relied upon to maintain compliance through implied rather than actual consequence. Elmer Castellan received recognition from federal authorities for his cooperation, his careful private documentation having provided the initial thread that unraveled the entire conspiracy. He continued managing the Cattlemen's Bank with what Wade observed to be a renewed sense of purpose, no longer carrying the particular nervous weight that had characterized their first meeting. Garland Dade received a reduced sentence in exchange for his comprehensive cooperation, though Wade harbored no illusions about whatever genuine remorse the reduction might have reflected, understanding Dade's confession as the same cold calculation that had governed every other decision in his violent career. Whitlock received a sentence reflecting his role as operational manager rather than direct killer, sufficient to ensure decades of imprisonment without quite matching Pemberton's life sentence. Wade stayed at the Callaway Ranch through the following winter, helping Hannah rebuild the operation's productivity and confidence after months of uncertainty and neglect. He found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, settling into the rhythm of ranch work with a satisfaction he hadn't anticipated, his 15 years of cattle experience proving immediately useful in ways that felt like returning to something essential rather than simply marking time. Spring came to the Canadian River Valley with the particular green abundance that followed hard winters in cattle country, and Wade stood on the riverbank where Reese Callaway had died, watching water move past with the same indifferent persistence it had carried for centuries before any of them arrived to claim ownership over its banks. Hannah joined him there, the 2 siblings standing together in comfortable silence that had become their particular language across the difficult months since her letter had reached him in Fort Worth. "I keep thinking about what Pemberton said," Hannah said finally. "About small ranchers being inefficient. About sacrifice being necessary for progress. Men like Pemberton always have language like that," Wade said. "Makes murder sound like arithmetic instead of what it actually is." Hannah looked at the river, the water that had taken her husband and had also, in the federal investigation that followed, provided the foundation for justice that eventually reached the men responsible. "Reese loved this land," she said. "Not because it was efficient. Because he built it himself, with his own hands, into something that mattered to him." She looked at her brother. "That's what they never understood. The land isn't valuable because of what it produces. It's valuable because of what it means to the people who actually work it." Wade thought about his own 15 years working cattle for other men's operations, the particular satisfaction of honest labor that asked nothing more complicated than skill and persistence in exchange for its rewards. He thought about the missing fingers on his left hand, the cost of work that had occasionally turned dangerous, and the deeper cost Reese had paid for refusing to surrender what he'd built to men who valued only extraction and accumulation. "I'm staying," he said, the decision arriving with the particular clarity of something he'd been approaching gradually without fully acknowledging it until the words emerged. "If you'll have me. This ranch needs someone who understands cattle work, and I find I'm tired of riding toward other people's troubles instead of building something of my own." Hannah's eyes filled with the first unguarded emotion he'd seen from her since his arrival months earlier. "Reese would have liked that," she said. "He always said the ranch needed more family on it, not less." They stood together at the river's edge as the spring sun moved across grassland that stretched toward horizons in every direction, land that had cost a man his life and had nearly cost Wade his own, land that now stood reclaimed and properly documented under federal protection that ensured no future Pemberton could manufacture false claims against it without facing immediate and comprehensive consequence. The Canadian River continued its patient movement toward the Gulf, indifferent to the violence and justice that had played out along its banks, carrying water that would nourish grassland and cattle long after the specific names and crimes of this particular chapter had faded into the broader history of a territory still working out exactly what kind of place it intended to become. Wade Garrity picked up a stone from the riverbank and turned it in his scarred hand, feeling its solid permanence, and thought that perhaps this was what his father had never managed to teach him before dying young in Comanche country, that the measure of a life wasn't found in what you survived, but in what you chose to build afterward and who you chose to build it with. "Come on," he said to his sister. "There's fence line that needs mending before the herd moves to summer pasture." They walked back together toward the ranch house, leaving the river to its endless patient work, carrying forward into whatever came next the particular durable inheritance that honest work and hard-won justice, however incomplete, however costly, had finally made possible.